Welcome to the video for chapter 24 of the Cambridge Introduction to Sanskrit, which is going to tell you about S stems and about imperatives. First of all, S stems. We've already looked at a variety of other nominal stems, such as short A stems, long A stems, long I, long U stems, dental stems, and so on. Now we will look at S stems, that is nominal forms whose stem ends in the sound S. S stems can be nouns and they can be adjectives. Most S stem nouns are neuter, and most non-neuter S stems actually are adjectives, or specifically bahuvrihi adjectives whose last member is an S stem noun. So for example, on the basis of the neuter S stem noun manas, meaning mind, we get the bahuvrihi adjective su manas, literally meaning someone whose mind is good and therefore good-minded or benevolent. S stems employ the exact same endings as other consonant stems, which we were introduced to in chapter 15. However, we do need to look at S stems separately because of the internal sandhi patterns that they display. And those sandhi patterns are as follows. We have different kinds of S stems, and they differ in what vowel precedes the stem final S. Specifically, we have as, is, and us stems. Now, before endings that begin with a vowel, as remains as it is, while is and us turn into ish and ush respectively due to the rookie rule, which was introduced in chapter 9. Before endings that begin with a voiced consonant, as changes into o, while is and us change into ir and ur respectively. And in word final position, as well as before endings that begin with unvoiced consonants, which is the case in the locative plural ending su, the final S of any S stem changes into visarga. That was all rather abstract, so let's look at two actual examples of S stems, specifically the two examples that we were introduced to just a minute ago, manas, a neuter noun meaning mind, and su manas, an adjective meaning good-minded or benevolent. Now, in S stems, just as in other consonant stems, masculine and feminine are formally identical. They have the same endings throughout the paradigm. And as in many other stems, neuters are different from masculines only in nominative, vocative, and accusative. That means that from the instrumental onwards, we have one set of forms for all three genders, whereas in nominative, vocative, accusative, we have one form for the neuters and another form that is shared by masculine and feminine. First of all, the neuter. Let's look at manas, the noun, meaning mind. In nominative, vocative, accusative, we have no ending added, and through external sandhi, the S at the end of manas changes into visarga, and so we get the form manach. In the rest of the singular, we have endings that all begin with vowels, a, e, ach, I, and in front of those vowels, the stem final as remains exactly as it is. So we have manasa, manase, manasach, manasach, manasi. Then in the dual, we have in nominative, vocative, accusative the ending I that we already encountered, for example, in the dental stem jagati, two worlds. So here we have manasi, two minds. And in front of this I, the as again remains unchanged. Then in instrumental dative ablative, we have the ending bhyam, which begins with a voiced consonant, bh. And in front of this voiced consonant, the as changes into o, and therefore we have mano bhyam. Finally, in the genitive and locative, we have an ending that begins with a vowel, or, and again in front of this vowel, o, at the beginning of or, the as remains unchanged, and so we have a genitive locative form, manasoch. Then the nominative, vocative, accusative plural is perhaps a little unexpected. It is manansi. What we here see is the a in front of the s lengthened and a nasal inserted, giving us manans, and then we find an I added, so the form is manansi. Compare this to, for example, jaganti, the corresponding form of jagat, where we also had a nasal added before the stem final sound, and we had an e added onto the stem final sound. The only difference here is that in front of s, the nasal does not appear as a full nasal, but it appears as an anuswara, and also the a that precedes the s, so we have the stem as, this short a is lengthened, so we get manansi. Then in the instrumental, dative and ablative plural, we again have endings that begin with voiced consonants. Bhich and bihach both begin with bh, and in front of those, the as again changes into o, and so we have manobich and manobiach. The genitive plural has the ending am, which begins with a vowel, so once again the as remains unchanged, manasam. And the locative plural finally begins with an unvoiced consonant, namely s. In front of this s, the as at the end of manas changes into ach, so we have manachsu. So much for the neuters. Now for the masculine and feminine forms, those, as we said, are different from the neuter only in nominative, vocative and accusative. And in the singular we have the following. In the nominative, we find the form sumanach, which is best just memorized, sumanach. In the vocative, we find just the stem, no ending, and again, through external sandhi, the final s changes into a visarga, so we get sumanach. Then in the accusative, we get the ending am added that we already know from dental stems, for example, marutam, accusative singular of marut. And in front of this am, again, the as remains unchanged, so we get sumanasam. In the dual, nominative, vocative, accusative, we get the ending au that we also already know, and in front of this au, which begins with a vowel, the as remains unchanged, so we have sumanasau. And in the nominative, vocative, accusative plural, we have the ending ach that we also already know from dental stems, and in front of this ach, which also begins with a vowel, namely a, the stem ending in as remains unchanged, and so we have sumanasach as the nominative, vocative, accusative plural form for the masculine and feminine. The neuter forms of sumanas would decline exactly like the forms of the neuter s-stem noun manas. Let's look at two more examples, namely chakshus, which is a neuter noun meaning eye, and achakshus, an adjective meaning one whose eyes are not, who is without eyes, i.e. who is blind. Those are all also s-stems, but as was mentioned earlier, we have different sandhi, internal sandhi patterns between as stems on the one hand and is and us stems on the other. So we need to look at an example of either an is or an us stem, and that's exactly what we've got here, namely two us stems. And again, we have in these the same endings for all three genders from instrumental onwards. We have one form for the neuter and another form for the masculine and feminine in the other three cases, so in nominative, vocative and accusative. Again, let's begin with the neuter. Chakshus, in the nominative, vocative, accusative singular, does not add an ending, and so again, through external sandhi, the s changes into visarga, and so we get chakshuh. In the instrumental dative, ablative, genitive, locative, we again have endings that begin with or are vowels, and in front of these vowels, us changes into ush through the Ruki rule, and so we get chakshusha, chakshushe, chakshushach, chakshushach, chakshushi. In the dual, nominative, vocative, accusative, we again get the ending e, and again in front of an ending that begins with a vowel or that is a vowel, us changes into ush, and so we get chakshushi. Then in the instrumental dative ablative, we have an ending that begins with a voiced consonant. Biham begins with b, which is voiced, and in front of this b, us changes into ur, and therefore we get chakshur biham. In the genitive and locative, we again have an ending that begins with a vowel, namely o in och, And in front of this vowel, us again changes into ush, and so we get chakshushuch. In the nominative, vocative, accusative plural in the neuter, we get chakshungshi, which is basically parallel to manansi. So the vowel is lengthened, a nasal is added, and then we have the S and the final E. The only difference is that, again, through the rookie rule, the S at the end of the stem changes into sh, and so we get not chakshungsi, but chakshungshi. In the instrumental dative ablative plural, we again have endings that begin with voiced consonants, and again in front of these voiced consonants, specifically in front of bh, us changes into ur, and so we have chakshurbich, chakshurbiach, chakshurbiach. Genitive plural has the ending am, which begins with a vowel, and so us again changes into ush, and so we have chakshusham. And in the locative plural, we have the ending su, which begins with the unvoiced s, which means that the us that precedes it changes into uch. However, rather than getting chakshuch su, we get through rookie the s changing into a sh, and so we get chakshuch shu. So much for the neuter. Now in the masculine and feminine, we again have forms that are different from the neuter only in nominative, vocative, and accusative, so let's look at those. In the singular, we actually have one formal difference from us stems, one form where we have a different ending in us and is stems than we have in us stems, and that is in the nominative singular, where we have achakshuch, which is identical to the vocative singular achakshuch. Remember, in us stems we had sumanach and sumanach. Here we have not achakshuch, but we have achakshuch for the nominative and also for the vocative. That is the one case where we have a different ending in us and us stems than we would in us stems. Then from the accusative on, the endings are exactly as we know them from the us stems. So accusative singular am as the ending. In front of this am, which begins with a vowel, us changes into ush, and so we have achakshusham. Then in the dual, nominative, vocative, accusative have the by now well-known ending au, and so we get achakshu shau with us changing into ush in front of a vowel. And in the nominative, vocative, accusative plural, we have the ending ach, which we also already know, and which also begins with a vowel. And so in front of this ach, we have us changing into ush, and we have the form achakshu shach. Just as in us stems, the neuter forms of achakshus are identical in their endings to the forms of chakshus. And now for something completely different, namely imperatives. In English, imperatives express direct commands. When I say pay attention, run, stop, or something like that, I address someone directly and I tell them what to do or what not to do. Sanskrit imperatives are a little broader in their meaning, a little broader in scale. Second person imperatives do express direct commands, for example, go. Third person imperatives express indirect commands. So for example, I could say about someone, may he go, or let him go. Some grammarians also count certain exhortations as first person imperatives. So there would be expressions such as let's go, no matter whether it's addressed to two people, so that would be a first person dual imperative, or many people, that would be a first person plural imperative. There are two things we need to do now. First of all, look over the various forms that Sanskrit uses to express the imperative. We will see that that is a fair number of forms because we have imperatives for all three persons, first, second, and third. For all three numbers, singular, dual, and plural. We have different endings in the active and in the middle. And we have different endings yet again between imperatives of thematic verbs and imperatives of athematic verbs. Which leads us to the second thing we need to do, which is look at how to best memorize these forms, which actually will be less difficult than it sounds right now, and also look at which forms we need to remember altogether, because many of these forms, many of these existing imperative forms actually are so rare that if you don't know them, you will hardly ever be at a disadvantage when you're reading a Sanskrit text. So let's begin with the active imperative forms of the thematic verb bhar, class 1, present tense bharati, meaning to carry. Here we have bharani, bhara, bharatu, bharava, bharatam, bharatam, bharama, bharata, bharantu. In the middle, we have bharai, bharasva, bharatam, bharavahai, bharetam, bharetam, bharamahai, bharadwam, bharantam. Notice that the shaded fields contain forms where basically the imperative is identical to the imperfect form, but without an augment. So whereas in the imperfect we would have the dual abharava, abharatam, abharatam, here we have bharava, bharatam, bharatam. Then on to athematic imperatives. And here we are looking at the forms of the verb bhuj, which means to enjoy and is class 7. And so it has a strong stem bhunaj and a weak stem bunj. What we find is as follows in the active. Bhunajani, bhungdi, bhunaktu, bhunajawa, bhunktam, bhunktam, bhunajama, bhunkta, bunjantu. Then in the middle, bhunajai, bhunkshwa, bhunktam, bhunajawahai, bunjatam, bunjatam, bhunajamahai, bunktvam, bunjatam. Notice that here again, the shaded fields contain forms that are identical to their imperfect counterparts, just without the augment. And something else that we need to notice here is the forms in blue are the forms that use the strong stem. So that would be all the first persons. Notice that this is different from what we normally find. Normally we have strong forms in the singular and weak forms in the dual and the plural. Here, for certain historical reasons, we have strong forms in these so-called first person imperatives. We have the weak form, the weak stem everywhere else, with the exception of the third singular active, which is bhunaktu as opposed to bhunktu. That, as we said, was a fair number of new forms. So what we need to do now is see which of these forms we actually need to know. Among imperatives, the second singular imperative, and especially the second singular active imperative, probably is the one that appears most frequently throughout Sanskrit literature. So let's make sure that we know the various shapes that it can take. First of all, in thematic verbs, the second singular active imperative basically is the present stem without any ending. So of bhur, we have the third singular form bharati. When we take off the ending ti, we're left with bhara, which is the stem. And this stem, bhara, means carry. Similarly, for example, with lik. Likati, stem lika, means write. Smr, smarati, the stem would be smara, and smara means remember, and so on. In athematic verbs, on the other hand, the second singular active imperative employs the ending dhi, or alternatively hi. Dhi is what we find after consonants. For example, bung dhi means enjoy. So we find the weak stem, and to that we add dhi. If we have a weak stem that ends in a vowel, then we find either this dhi or more frequently hi. So for example, of brew, to speak, we have brew hi, meaning speak. An exception to this is class 5 verbs, which as their second singular imperative use the weak present stem without any ending. So basically they are similar to thematic imperatives, where we also have the present stem without any ending. Here we have the weak present stem without any ending. So, for example, from shru, to listen, we have the strong stem shrunoti, the weak stem shrunu, and this weak stem then functions as the second singular imperative. Shrunu simply means listen. So much for second singular active imperatives. They occur relatively frequently. Be prepared to recognize them, be prepared to form them. However, when we look back to this rather large array of imperative forms overall, we should also notice that first-person imperatives actually are really rare. When you read a Sanskrit text, it can safely be said that you're going to be fine even if you don't know first-person imperatives. Furthermore, many imperative forms actually are identical to the corresponding imperfect forms, just without the augment. So what you need to be able to do is, when you encounter a form that looks exactly like an imperfect, but is missing the augment, you need to remember, this was an imperative form. So what you should actively do is focus on memorizing the remaining second and third person forms, i.e. the second and third person imperative forms that are not identical to imperfect minus augment. The second singular, as we just mentioned, appears particularly frequently, and that's the second singular not just in the active but also in the middle. And a good way of remembering the most frequent second singular forms actually is just to memorize these common examples, which are uttishta, stand up, from tishtati, which is a thematic active verb. So what we have is the present tense stem without any endings, tishta, or here it's a compound verb, uttishta, stand up. Yudhyasva, fight, which is a second singular middle imperative of a thematic verb. Bruhi, which is the second singular active imperative of an athematic verb. And shrunu, listen, which is an example of a class 5 second singular active imperative, and this is important because class 5s are the exception to how athematic verbs form their imperatives. Class 5 verbs form their imperatives just like thematic verbs, meaning they use just the stem without any ending, and specifically they use the weak stem. So uttishta, yutyasva, bruhi, shrunu. And now finally a few notes on something relating to imperatives. In English, negative and positive commands are expressed in parallel ways. I can say fight, I can say don't fight. Don't fight would be a negated or a negative command. Listen, don't listen. Look, don't look. Exactly parallel, it's just the negative has the don't in the beginning. In Sanskrit, on the other hand, negated commands can be expressed using the imperative, but much more frequently are expressed in other ways, namely, always by means of the little particle ma, which means don't, and that is then combined either with an augmentless aorist, which is something we will be introduced to in chapter 38, ma plus actually an imperative, so for example, ma gaccha, don't go, or also ma plus a potential form, so for example, ma gacchit, may he not go, let him not go, he should not go. Another fairly frequent way of expressing a negated command actually is by use of alam plus a noun in the instrumental. Alam bhayena, or through Sandhi, alam bhayena, literally means enough with fear, and this is used in the same way that in English we would use don't be afraid. Similarly, alam krodhena, so through Sandhi, alam krodhena, would be enough with anger, krodach is anger, enough with anger, and that again would in English be expressed as don't be angry. So again, a negated command, don't be something, in Sanskrit can be expressed by means of alam plus a noun, not a verb form, a noun in the instrumental case. And yet another way of expressing a negated command would be to use a negated gerundive. We haven't had gerundives yet, they won't be introduced until chapter 34, but still let's look at one example. In narach na hantavyach, we have narach, man, na, not, and hantavyach, the gerundive of han, to kill, and hantavyach means having to be killed. So narach na hantavyach literally is the man not having to be killed. And when this is used as a sentence, then in English we'd need to put in a form of to be. So the man is not having to be killed. The man is a not to be killed one, which in more idiomatic English would be the man or he must not be killed. And that in effect often is equivalent to in English saying don't kill him. That was it for this chapter. We hope that you found this video helpful, and if you have any comments or suggestions, we would love to hear from you. Please do write to us at rupel@cambridge-sanskrit.org. And now, for your own work on this material, good luck and have fun!